Welcome back to the basic series about schema therapy, and in the upcoming videos and in this one we're going to talk everything schemas. The schemas are actually derived from basic emotional needs that aren't met properly, and we have 5 basic emotional needs, so we're going to make 5 videos, and by the end all schemas will be discussed. I find it important that you know that this information is mostly coming from these sources. So since I'm a junior schema therapist, I've done the base course 5 years ago, and next year I want to do the second one, is that I find it's always important, but especially with this series, is that you actually know where this information is coming from and that it is mostly an easy or a different way of gaining this knowledge if you don't want to read it or you want to have some extra information about it. Is we're going to use the most basic book, that is the Schema Therapy written by Jung and the updated version. Then we have the book Reinventing Your Life. This is a book also written by Jung, but more for clients. It is quite an old book, but I would say a golden oldie because it is written towards clients. The first 13 schemas are explained in this book, and it is really done in, I would say, an understandable but still comprehensive way. So it is actually a nice book also to read as a therapist because you actually learn about the language that you can use with clients, and I find it very useful that in the book they really describe how a schema can develop. Then we have the last part, and that is not a book, but that is actually a paper. A couple of years ago, a very bright researchers and clinical practitioners from all around the world in schema therapy came together, and they kind of thought for a long while and discussed like, okay, how is the schema therapy model looking right now? Are adjustment needed? And they proposed like a new form. It is mostly 2 new added basic emotional needs with schemas, and they make a stronger link between the coping modes with each schema. And you can read it there. They also made a table for every schema. I'm gonna use it within the slides, but I find it very important to wait for the actual results and for I would say the senior schema therapist to explain that thoroughly. But just know that it is there, and you can pause the slides if you want to read it. It is also freely available for everyone. So firstly, we have the need for safety and nurturance. And as you can imagine, this is our most basic and fundamental emotional need. It is this idea that you grow up in an environment where you feel safely attached to your caregivers, and that you are being seen in your upbringing, and that you belong to a group, to your family, and eventually also to friends, to schoolmates, and about being safe. So these 4 words kind of describe it very well. It's about safely attachment, about belonging, about being seen and being safe. And this idea is that if that basic need is mostly met within the family, it will make it easier to expand that towards friends, etc. And that if these needs aren't properly met, this can develop schemas that become dysfunctional over the time of life. And when adults come to therapy, they might struggle with these concepts. And what kind of environment do we think of? Here you can see some pictures, but it is mostly about neglectful environments when it is very cold and detached, about abusive environments when there is physical, sexual, emotional abuse, or when there is a lot of, I would say, unpredictability. So children have to move houses every week because of parents' divorce, or the parents are fighting a lot. There is a lack of stability throughout the childhood. It can also be that there is unsafety, or like because a parent is physically or mentally ill and therefore can't really meet the needs of the child. In the book, they describe the typical family of origin as cold, detached, rejecting, withholding, lonely, explosive, unpredictable, or abusive. So it isn't a great environment to grow up in, to say the least. And you can imagine that the longer this takes place, or the more often it takes place, sometimes that actually translates to these schemas being even more strongly. we have 5 schemas that are linked to these type of environments, and I think they derive very logically from this basic emotional need. So when there isn't properly met in safety and nurturance, the schemas can develop of emotional deprivation, of mistrust and abuse, of abandonment, social isolation, and shame and inferiority. And we're going to go through them separately. And the first schema is the schema of emotional deprivation. And you can mostly tie that to neglect. So this idea that in adulthood, someone really has this idea that other people aren't going to meet their needs. And how do you actually measure that? With the Young Schema questionnaire, these items are linked to it. And I think this gives a great idea about what it actually means for people to have an emotional deprivation scheme in adulthood. So we have things like, I haven't had someone to nurture me, share him or herself with me, or care deeply about everything that happens to me. I don't have people to give me warmth, holding, and affection. I haven't felt that I'm special to someone. I haven't had someone who really listens to me, understands me, or is in tuned into my true needs and feelings. And I haven't had a strong or wise person to give me sound advice or direction when I'm not sure what to do. So it is really kind of that people are convinced that people aren't there for them. And that is often also what they experienced. So when we look at how does this emotional deprivation schema develop, it's how they describe it also in this book that is written for clients is kind of this list. So that parents are cold and distant, I would say just neglectful. When the child didn't feel loved, important, or special, the child didn't receive enough time or attention. Parents couldn't sense the child's needs or didn't understand their world, so lacked emotional connection. Parents didn't comfort the child didn't learn how to comfort themselves, or the parents gave no guidance or structure. So the child really doesn't develop proper self-direction. So yeah, it has neglect written all over it. And these are often things that you can look out for in people's upbringing. And when the schema is activated, a schema consists of beliefs such as no one will be there for me, but it also consists of the bodily sensations, emotions, and the whole memory network. And when that is activated in someone, how they respond to that schema activation can differ. And they kind of operationalized it in a more fight, flight, freeze way, in a way that you can actually surrender yourself to the schema. This is idea that you behave in a way that actually shows that the schema is true. That's why there is like a green flag. You behave in accordance to the schema. Then we have more avoidance coping. So that is that you react to the activation of the schema by wanting to avoid the schema. And lastly, we have kind of the overcompensation or more the inversion. So you kind of react with the opposite. That is why the Uno reverse card is there. So you will respond in a way that is the opposite of the schema. So when we think about the schema, that you kind of have this idea, no one will meet my needs. So when you act in accordance with that, when you are in green, you will kind of discourage others to give you that because you're already convinced that they won't give it to you. That also means that you might attach yourself subconsciously or consciously to people who are cold and detaching and neglectful, such as with partners, with friends, with colleagues. And that will actually, you act as if the schema is true. When it is more of an avoidance of the schema, you will probably detach yourself from making connections. So you withdraw yourself from social intimacy. And the last one is when you do the Uno reverse. So you start behaving in a way that is the opposite of the schema. So when you kind of expect no one to be there for you, the opposite would be expecting them to fulfill all your emotional needs. So you might start to kind of overly expectate things. Then here you can see how they propose it in the new schema. So it is like a bit broader, I would say, set up with the different modes named and attached to this schema. It is very interesting. I would definitely also read it, but for now, I will just mention it and we go to the second schema. The second schema is the schema of mistrust and abuse. So this is this idea, the dysfunctional schema in adulthood where you feel that other people will eventually harm you, abuse you, or take advantage of you. So, and how can we actually measure that? Here you can see the Young Schema questionnaire items, and I think again that gives kind of a good idea about what the schema is. So we have items that like, I feel that people will take advantage of me. I feel that I can't let my guard down in the presence of other people or they will hurt me. It is only a matter of time someone betrays me. I'm quite suspicious of people's motives and I'm usually on the lookout for people's ulterior or hidden motives. So kind of this screams mistrust, but also really this highly vigilant thing of being on the lookout and suspicious of what people might do to you. And I find this also having like an overlap with what we see in more trauma survivors, that overactive nervous system that is constantly kind of looking out for threats, that it has really a correspondence with how this schema looks like. And when we look at how does a schema like this develop, it wouldn't come as a surprise if this screams abuse all over. So we have being physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, being repeatedly humiliated, bullied, or belittled, that parents couldn't be trusted, so more broken promises, that they exploited you or lied deliberately. Parents took pleasure in the child's suffering. Parents constantly warned you to not trust other people, so their mistrust was kind of placed onto you and how you see the world. The family members were against you, or parents behaved inappropriately with you. So where emotional deprivation has kind of neglect all over it, this has abuse in any way all over it. And if we look again at, if a schema is activated, which is again the cognitions, but also the bodily sensations, the emotions, and the whole memory network where you have been exploited or abused, is when that schema gets activated and we act as if that schema is true, you will probably over-vigilant and really suspicious of others, right? If you really believe that that schema is true and you also act in that way, you're gonna probably be tiptoeing, you're gonna probably look out for probably red flags, but it can also mean that you kind of form your world around you in a way that is aligned with the schema, such as choosing untrustworthy or abusive partners, friends, or a job that, for example, is really exploitative. If we want to avoid this, if you want to avoid this schema, you will probably mostly detach yourself from relationships. Or in relationship, you stay very vigilant, so you won't disclose a lot about yourself, you will stay distant, and this is kind of this idea of putting up high walls. The opposite again, so if we have a mistrust schema and you start to do the Uno reverse and act in the opposite, it will mostly mean that you be too trustworthy, so you might overly attach yourself very quickly, you are not on the lookout for red flags, or you do the Uno reverse by becoming harmful or exploitative to other people. Again, for this schema, there is also a whole new proposition. It is not exactly completely new. I think what they did properly in the new model is that they really attached certain modes to the schema. So modes actually became a later part. First we had schema therapy, then the modes came. And I think with this new revision, there is just a better connection between the two. Again, interesting to read. You can pause it. You can also look it up. So the third schema is the schema of abandonment, which in the easiest way is this idea that in adulthood, you kind of believe that other people will eventually leave you or abandon you physically, emotionally. And you measure this with items like, I find myself clinging to people I'm close to because I'm afraid they will leave me. I need other people so much that I worry about losing them. I worry that people I feel close to will leave me or abandon me. When someone I care for seems to be pulling away or withdrawing from me, I feel desperate. Sometimes I'm so worried about people leaving me that I drive them away. And so you can also kind of hear the different behaviors towards it, but in the base, it is really this worrying, this idea that other people will abandon you. And how does that develop? The easiest way is to theorize that it develops because a child or adolescent has been abandoned repeatedly. Here there are also some other things that are mentioned which are interesting. So there can be a predisposition for abandonment anxiety. One of the parents died or left at a young age. A parent had to go to a hospital or away for a period of time. You might have been raised by a nanny in a children's home or in a boarding school. A parent was very unstable, so this that you really didn't know if they were gonna abandon you. So they might have been depressed, angry, intoxicated, or emotionally unavailable. A parental divorce, or parents fought so often that children feared their family would fall apart. A parent's attention shifted during childhood, for example, due to remarriage, that someone forms a new life with new children, or because of work, and growing up in a closed-off family with excessive protection. So summarized, it is real or threatened abandonment. However, I feel with this is that it's also broader when there isn't really, I would say, even when parents kind of do try to meet the need for safety and nurturance, when they, for example, are ill a lot or they die, it can still lead to the development of this schema, even though there is not a real malevolence to it. And again, how does the schema development look like? We look at when someone acts accordingly to the schema, when it is aligned, you act as if the schema is true, you avoid it, or you do the reverse. When you act in line with this schema, you are actually convinced that people will leave you. So you might become very clingy. You might, in a way, again, choose partners that will eventually leave you or are unpredictable, because that actually is in accordance with the schema. With avoidance, it's more again, avoiding forming connections. And with the overcompensation, that is a really interesting part, because how it is theorized here, it is much more about the clingy and the obsessive behaviors. However, if we think about you actually act as if the opposite is true, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And I find this one in the new model much better theorized here. So I will use that one, is that this idea that the opposite of being abandoned is that you feel that no one will abandon you, or that you don't even care about it. So you become hyper autonomous, or you start kind of clowning that I don't need people, that attitude. And you see that also described here, besides also the Boolean attack and the more coding or manipulation. Interesting stuff. And I think that when it comes to the schema of abandonment, this new model actually makes much more sense. So again, pause it and read it if you like. Then we go to the fourth schema. This is the schema of social isolation. And that means that someone in adulthood with this schema really feels that they are different, that they don't belong to a group. And items that actually measure this is I don't fit in, I'm fundamentally different from other people, I don't belong, I'm a loner, I feel alienated or cut off from other people, and I always feel on the outside of groups. Interestingly, like, how does this develop? It is that we often see in childhood that someone already felt inferior to other kids. That can be because they have been bullied for something, or that they have been rejected by other children. It can be that that your home situation was very different from other people. So you might have grown up in a classroom, like you might have been in a classroom where the way you were growing up was very different. So you actually feeling like an outsider, maybe even within your family, but it doesn't have to be that you also feel that within your family. And the last thing is that being passive, so doing what was expected without developing personal preferences. So this can actually lead to this idea that you have nothing to bring to conversations. So it is mostly, I would say, about already feeling that you were different as a child because of being bullied or because your family was different to the other kids. And when someone has a schema of social isolation, we look at how do they act in accordance with the schema. That will mostly be like, if you think that you don't have anything to bring, you might don't be around people, or you might stay very passive, like the cat who is looking out of the group but not really participating in it. So you're kind of withdrawing yourself even though you are in a social situation. With avoidance, you kind of avoid social connections altogether. And the overcompensation is much more that you kind of try to be really popular, or you kind of change something about yourself so that you fit in. So this is actually this idea of an avatar or a mask or like a false persona, so that you still feel like you belong to the group. And yeah, in the base, it often doesn't really work like that, but that is what you see more in overcompensation. Also, again, I find with this one, with the new theory, very interesting, because I feel like the overcompensation didn't sometimes make a lot of sense in the old, I would say, conceptualization. And here they also say it much more as if someone is in overcompensation. It can also be like, I don't need anyone. I'm better because I don't want to belong to this group. So it's much more of this self-aggrandizing, but it can also be that, like we just mentioned, that being the life of the party, like putting on this persona. Here you can see them actually again, and yeah, interesting stuff. I think in general, this is an interesting time to be a schema therapist because so much is changing, and I think for the better. But let's go to the last one. This is the schema of defectiveness and shame. I often call it inferiority because that is an easier word for me to say in English, but it is actually this idea that you feel a lot of shame of who you are, or you feel that you are inherently inferior or bad compared to other people. So this is this idea that you are actually below others. And it is measured with items such as no man or woman I desire could love me once he or she would see my flaws and defects. No one I desire would want to stay close to me if he or she knew the real me. I'm unworthy of love, attention, and respect of others. I feel that I'm not lovable. I'm too unacceptable in very basic ways to reveal myself to other people or to let them go to know me as well. So it is really this idea that inherently you are flawed or have parts that are so shameful that you should never let them see to other people. This schema develop. There are a lot of different ways. We talked about neglect and abuse. And often when a child grows up in those kind of environments, it already forms this idea that there is something wrong with them. So those environments also lead to often this schema. But like, let's look at the more specific ones. So growing up in a family environment where a caregiver was extremely critical, punitive, or humiliating. Frequently being criticized for your appearance, behavior, or the way of speaking. Parents conveyed a sense of disappointment in the child. One or both parents were emotionally unavailable, withheld affection, or rejected the child. So that is more than neglect. Experiencing sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. Being often blamed for problems within the household. Siblings were favored. And following parental separation or abandonment, the child believed it was their fault. So I would say there are much broader kind of reasons for this schema to develop. And it is like a lot of family dynamics can actually lead to the development of defectiveness and shame. And this is also a schema that you see kind of in a lot of people, that there is some elevation, and they often coexist with the other schemas within this emotional need domain. So, okay, how does that look like? So the schema gets activated. Again, those are the beliefs, but also the emotions, the bodily sensations, and this whole memory network of all the times they feel like they were inferior or that they should be ashamed of themselves. Is that when you act in accordance to that, you actually believe that you are inferior. So the behavior would be putting yourself down, or when someone else does that, you're kind of okay with it because you actually believe that. So you might also attract people, friends, or a work environment that is highly critical. When avoidance, it is much more of really not sharing certain parts of yourself. So you might still be in social connection, but because of that fear of rejection, you might leave out a lot or put on a persona. With overcompensation, I think this is also quite of a common overcompensator, is the perfectionism. So you actually believe that you are inferior, but you start acting as the opposite. So you really start to act as if you might actually be superior in ways. You see that a lot, for example, with the more narcissistic dynamics, that this is often the schema that is below it, but they act as if they are actually superior. But it can also be like that, working very hard to kind of not show yourself or the world those parts. So it's a lot of compensating behaviors. Again, here you can see what it is theorized in the new model. And those are actually the 5 schemas. So we have emotional deprivation, mistrust, abandonment, isolation, and shame. And they often kind of come in, I would say, heightened levels across the domain, which makes sense because they are kind of related. However, research has shown that these are really separate constructs as well. We talk mostly about dysfunctional schemas. Recently, there is more attention towards positive schemas, and here you can see some of them attached to the need for nurturance and safety when that has been properly met. And you kind of hope that when that is met again in adulthood, maybe through therapy and the changes because of it, is that these positive schemas develop. We know that it is not necessarily a continuum when here you have the dysfunctional schema and here the functional. There are like separate constructs, but they do overlap with each other. So here you see the schema of emotional fulfillment. And that is like, for the most part, I've had someone who really listens to me, understands me, or is in tune with my true emotional needs and feelings. And this is actually linked to emotional deprivation, and it is like 0.67. Then we have the stable attachment. So this is this idea that I feel confident that the people I'm close to won't leave me or abandon me. And this is mostly linked to abandonment with a 0.6. So you do see there is some overlap, or they are correlated to each other, but it is not the same thing. And we have the schema of social belonging. So I usually feel included in groups, which is mostly linked to social isolation. So I find this interesting stuff. I really think that it is a good thing that the positive schemas are much more included. Also because eventually in therapy, you hope that the dysfunctional schemas, of course, go down. But at the same time, you hope that the emotional schemas go up, the positive schemas. And that is really what is being researched right now. So that is the base for the basic emotional needs. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions, let me know. And I wish you a good day. Bye. Thank you for watching the video. On my website, you can find free schema therapy related forms that you can use with your clients. We have the form for basic emotional needs, which is kind of an explanation forms, but also has a fill-in assignment. And they are all free to download in Word and PDF. Then we have the case conceptualization, and there is a second page for treatment goals, and there's also an example that can be easily used for you and your clients. Then there is a form that is really focused on the schemas, and it has on the first page an explanation of different schemas, and there are kind of different rows where clients can fill in their questionnaire scores. And then there is like a whole section where they can fill in their most dominant schemas with all the different parts that are linked to schemas and the modes. And there's also a separate one for the modes with, again, an explanation of modes where they can fill in the scores on the SMI and can kind of dive into how it looks for them. And lastly, there is a schema diary that can be used throughout the treatment.